going to deal with Tachanun. Yeah, I sort of had the same reaction, Gary. I was like, I'm gonna attack. So what I really want to do is I want to take my people's prayer book and I want to redo the whole thing, but I do that because that would take a long time. Because it's really the explanation really great, and sort of with the historical pieces and the background and the history. But I think the reason that I wanted to tackle it is for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I think a lot of people zoom through it, zoom no pun intended, and I also think that that when somebody's coming to them for the first time, because we don't do Tachanun, majority of people come, and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right? Like we don't do Tachanun on days when there's a majority of our congregation there. You might walk into a minyan and somebody says, much like we do, Amidah Tachanun, and just moves right through it, right? And then people start to put their head on their hands, and it's like very foreign. I think it's not something that people are particularly used to. And so if you've joined the minyan, for the first time, maybe you can relate to that, right? Like if you can think back to the first time that you came to minyan, like maybe you can relate to that experience of having shown up to a weekday minyan, having not come any other time, but maybe Shabbat or Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur or something like that, and watch everybody put their hands down and like wondering what's going on. But so what I wanted to say is that I would love to just take this book and read the whole thing to you, because I think that the explanations, but what I did was I sort of picked things.
I'm assuming this is Rabbi Russell's block. She's back.
Where did I lose you? I can't hear you.
You said, I'm assuming. You were right near the beginning.
Go ahead. Where did I lose you?
You fairly close to the beginning.
Really?
You said everyone walks into the new minyan, and I'm assuming they.
Okay. It's like being on a phone call and then like not noticing that it dropped. Okay. What I was saying was that the reason I wanted to tackle it is because I think that a lot of times when somebody walks into a daily minyan who's only used to coming on Shabbat or even Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur on the big days, that you walk in and there's this cue given that's like, we're going to do the Amidah followed by Tachanun, and nobody ever says what Tachanun is, and nobody even there's no sort of explanation, and there's really not even a good closure of Tachanun. You kind of just move on to the next thing, and there's really just not a whole lot of talk around it. So I wanted to, and so what I opened by saying was I would love for you to all just take this book and read it, because it really has a great explanation. But what I'm going to do is pick some of the highlights. What I did was I picked some of the highlights of the explanation of it, and then of course pulled sources from other places, like some halachic sources, though there's not a lot. And if you want to have more, I can scan the opening piece of this book and give it out, because it's really worth more time than we have to explore it. So I'm going to share my screen as I usually do, and sort of start to go through some of the highlights. So just a bit of history, just a bit of sort of framing where Tachanun might actually come from. So also I should say, I want to make sure that I have, where do I have that Siddur here? Let's see. Okay, good. I want to just say at the top where Tachanun is, because maybe you don't know. So the Amidah happens, and then, so right now we do the Amidah silently, and then there is this moment for private prayer, which is called Tachanun. In biblical times, the idea was that confession, when you were confessing sins, was very, very personal. And so you would only confess sins that were yours, right? So you thought about the things the sins that you committed, and you confessed your own sins. By the end of the 2nd century, there was some sort of liturgical formulation that was happening. And so you ended up reciting pieces of liturgy that perhaps were not yours. So you can imagine, which is the next piece, right? On the high holidays, when we say, for the sin which we have committed before thee, for et cetera, for the sin, or Asham, and maybe you've sat there and you thought, I haven't actually, I don't know, eaten too much or something, right? Like one of the sins that we say on those days. But there was this idea of sort of collective prayer, and that the prayer leader was leading on behalf of the community and sort of said all of the confessions as if everybody could relate to them, or sort of be able to get something out of it, even if you yourself have not committed that sin. And then sometime after that, there's not a lot of clarity on the timeline. These long and short confessions were formulated, and particularly in the forms of acrostics. Again, like sins in order of letters, not necessarily because anyone had committed those specific sins, rather sort of to cover the full spectrum of what you may have sinned, and to make it sort of more prayer friendly or community friendly, so that people could follow along and be able to do this sort of community prayer. And then the last thing to consider is that when we talk about prostration, so when you've seen that people put their hand, down on their arm, when we talk about prostration, we were talking about fully lying on the ground. And I think we talked about that when we talked about bowing, there's this idea of nifilat apayim, that you're actually falling upon your face. And that also, as you know, we don't really do so much of that anymore, especially at weekday minions. The only time really of the year is at Yom Kippur. This idea that you're actually like laying completely on the ground in a full prostration, and we'll talk about some of that also. So Tachanun itself means, if you look in the Sim Shalom, and it means supplication. It's not exactly a petition. We have petitions in the Amidah. The assumption is that we're not asking for anything. We're not expecting anything in return. We're simply confessing, things that we perhaps feel bad about, or that we know we did wrong, or again, kind of confessing on behalf of the community. Two halachic terms that I want you to be aware of while we go through this. The first is reshut. Reshut means it's optional. And the second is a chiyuv, which you've probably heard. Chiyuv means that it's an obligation. And the reason that it's both is because that is what Tachanun is. It is both. There is really no clear, some people believe that it is optional. Some people believe, and by people I mean commentators, some commentators believe that it's reshut. Some people believe that it's optional. And some people believe that it's a chiyuv, that it's really an obligation. And we're going to see how some of those sort of walk us through some of those texts. Any questions up till this point? Can you all see? I see some squinting. Let me see. I can make it one more. Is that better? Okay. Any questions? Ernie? No, just clearing your throat. Okay. So here's the structure of the Tachanun. On Mondays and Thursdays, it's longer than on the other days. There is a common belief that perhaps it's longer because of something that we actually talked about in our class yesterday, which is Mondays and Thursdays being Torah reading days, but actually it has nothing to do with that at all. There's a midrash, there's an explanation that the reason that it's longer on Mondays and on Thursdays is because it was on a Thursday that God told Moses to ascend to Mount Sinai, and 40 days later on a Monday, Moses actually came down from the mountain. And so as a result of this midrash, as a result of this story, the idea that Moses was up Sinai and down Sinai on Monday and Thursday, these days have a higher level of divinity in some way. And so we add a much longer section on Mondays and on Thursdays. So this picture is a copy of the Isaac Klein, which I've shown you before. So on Mondays and Thursdays are considered, here we go, Yemei Ratzon, days of grace, on which prayer, as it were more readily accepted and the longer supplications are recited. Special merit of these days is ascribed to the tradition that Moses ascended Mount Sinai on the second tablets on a Thursday, returned on a Monday. And the longer Tachanun has 7 prayers that form a group of somber, deeply moving elegies and penitential prayers. They are said silently and standing. So we begin our Tachanun on a Monday or a Thursday. We begin standing. I think I have to
Can I ask
unshare.
about the standing, since we don't stand for that?
So, sorry?
We don't stand for that anymore, right? I mean,
Anymore as in, like,
when we do talking and we sit the whole time, don't we?
so the beginning part, you are supposed to be standing.
Huh.
We're going to get there. I'm going to show you this Siddur. Oops, let's see. It's just so that we can look at exactly what I'm talking about. Can you see that? Ooh, a lot of screens here. Okay. So this is the very opening, right? It says you can choose one. Sorry, I should have started at the very beginning. In the Siddur Sim Shalom, it says you can choose one of these. That's kind of like they've added some choice to this, and it's this long v'hurachum yachaper avon v'lo yashchit v'hirbala hashiva po v'lo ya'ir kol chamato, which we see otherwise in the liturgy. God, who is merciful, grants atonement from sin and does not destroy. Time and time again, God restrains wrath, refusing to let. So you can see it's kind of this language of confession in some way. Remember your compassion, reminding God to be compassionate and to uplift us, redeem us. You see the word Avinu Malkeinu, which sort of has echoes of the High Holiday liturgy and petitions in that way. And then we'll go back. I don't know how. I don't think I can go in between screens without sort of sharing and unsharing. So sorry about that. And then we're back here. Yeah, okay. And then we go essentially back and we follow the shorter Tachanun. And the shorter Tachanun looks like this. This is sort of the structure, which we'll look in the Siddur in 1 second. Vayomar David, which is a verse from 2 Samuel, forming this fitting introduction to the short confession that follows it. Rachum v'chanun is not in every Siddur. We're going to take a look and see if it falls in the Sim Shalom. Adonai al be'apcha, Psalm 6, so that's in there also. Then Shomer Yisrael, and then Ve'anachnu lo neda. So Shomer Yisrael is a hymn that continues, again, sort of this idea of compassion and protection of God who watches over all of us. And then Va'anachnu, a collection of biblical verses, the first being from King Chronicles 2, the remaining verses, the verse expressed. So it's a compilation of different pieces of text from Psalms and from, you can see Samuel, so different places in the Tanakh. And it's been compiled into this one section of liturgy called the Tachanun. So I'm going to go back over to the Siddur for the last time, and then so that we don't get too dizzy going back and forth like this. And so this is the rest of the sort of intro to Monday and Thursday. I'm obviously going through this very quickly. You should take a look at it more closely if you're interested. This is all the intro to Monday and Thursday. And then it's going to say, on days when the Torah is not read. So interestingly, the Sim Shalom leads you to believe the thing that I said was not true, right? So it says, on days when the Torah is not read, you begin here. It's a way that they categorize Monday and Thursday, but not to be confused, not to confuse you that the reason we don't do that we do a shorter one on Mondays or longer on Monday and Thursdays is because of the Torah. Anyway, that's just the way that the Sim Shalom notates it. And then there's the Vayomer David al Gad. We'll talk about the Sefer Torah in a second. Adonai al be'apecha, which is what it mentioned. Then there's some choice again. The way that this is obviously Hebrew English. Shomer Yisrael, and then the final piece, Ve'anachnu lo neda. So that's the general structure of the Tachanun, and we're going to see in just a second some different theories and some different minchagim and some, I guess you could consider halacha around the Tachanun and how you say it and when. Okay, going back. So when do we say the Tachanun? The Ramah, who is a commentator in the Shulchan Aruch, says what's probably the most one of the more popular opinions, which is that you only say Tachanun in community, and you only say Tachanun if you're before an ark. Now that makes for a very interesting conversation today, right? Because here we are on screens, and we've had this conversation in the ritual committee and also Rabbi Ain and I have talked about this before. That the fact that that the idea is that you're supposed to be before an ark. As you can see, it comes from Joshua, when Joshua fell on his face before the ark of Adonai. And even more so, it says only in the presence of a Sefer Torah affords a safe and controlled environment to invoke deen, to invoke some sort of judgment. So why have we decided that we can do tachanun outside of these spaces? And perhaps some of us are doing it differently, but it's going to give you something to think about as we go forward. There are still sources that say that you can do it outside, and I think that we want to sort of maintain some sort of normalcy on this forum, right? And the normalcy being that the Amidah is followed by the Tachanun. Now, the idea of sort of falling on your face before the ark is the questionable part, right? Because there's really no way to replicate that, and it's kind of your own what do you want to say? It's kind of your own interpretation as to what tachanun actually means to you, and your own prayer practice, as to whether or not you feel like you need a Torah in front of you to sort of ground you in your confession, is what I would say, right? So there's this idea that you have to be in front of an ark and you have to be in front of a Torah because, I'll quote here from the Mishnah Berurah, Torah affords a safe and controlled environment for invoking judgment. Now, I don't know if people believe that or not, or if people feel sort of compelled by that reason. And so if you do feel compelled by that reason, one thing that I have sort of played around with tachanun is not actually doing the falling on your face part, right? So maybe on Zoom, you've decided, okay, Zoom is different than being in community and being in the synagogue. And so I'm not going to actually, quote unquote, fall on my face. I'm not going to put my head down on my arm, but I am going to say the confessional prayers. I am going to say the supplications. But I'm just going to say them upright. Maybe for you, being in the presence of a Torah or being in the presence of an ark and being in a sanctuary has sort of carries real weight for you, and not being able to do it in a full way, would prevent you from doing it. I know that there are people that don't do tachanun, and by people I mean not necessarily communities, but there are some individuals who have decided that like tachanun is really something that's supposed to be done in community and at the synagogue and in front of an ark, and so therefore they don't say them. We haven't been together in community and in front of an ark for over a year, so that's something to consider. We're not talking about a short amount of time to just like X out an entire section of our prayer service, right? So I think it's something to consider. Again, going back to the opening of Reshut and Chiyuv, is this an option or is this an obligation? This is one of those for sure that is up to interpretation. And different communities have interpreted it differently. Wondering if anybody has any comments or any thoughts on that, their own practice, or if you've thought about it before. No pressure.
I'll jump in. I mean, my understanding among Ashkenazi communities is that it's almost a game to find an excuse not to say tachanun.
That's right.
And it's, it says on times of great joy, like a bar mitzvah, we don't do it when there's a tefillin bar mitzvah, for example, on Thursdays, or on times of sadness, we don't do it. Someone I know who grew up in an Orthodox family in Israel said his whole time growing up until he went to the army, he had never recited tachanun, because the old Polish rabbi came and announced every day it was the yortzeit of a great rabbi killed in the Shoah. And he said it was the first time he was in the army before he ever heard tachanun. Right.
And so because of that, what, Gary?
And it would be optional. I mean, it's required if it meets a certain set of circumstances, but there's many optional ways to get out of that requirement.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in rabbinical school, Rabbi Dorf he was kind of famous for this, standing in the back and calling out when you wouldn't say tachanun. He'd be like, "Did anyone see the baseball game last night? They won. No tachanun." So there was always a reason for it there too. Yeah, Marcia.
Well, I'm thinking I don't say tachanun because I don't read fast enough, and it gets to get through the Amida before we go to the next thing is all I can do. But I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, we have the Slakla, Nu Avinu. That's a confession. That's within the Amida. And so a lot of the things, it seems to me, that are in Tachanun, we've sort of done in the Amida. So I really don't feel like I've cheated myself of anything by not doing Tachnun because I don't read fast enough.
Great. And you know what? So this book that I keep highlighting says Reform Jews still omit it altogether because their 19th century forebears who established the principles for Reform worship disagreed with its prevailing sense of human unworthiness. So that's something to think about. And then the next sentence, which I just think relates so well to what you both just said, other Jews who do not say it may run through it so rapidly that a casual visitor in a synagogue may not even notice what is being said. Right? I mean, we sort of tack it on. But I like that, Marcia, that okay, so you don't do the full Tachanun, but it's not that you haven't done any confessions, because we have other places in our liturgy that allow us to do that. And so you don't feel like you're cheating yourself. And now I think even more so than when sort of the original, if you want to say original Tachanun, whatever that may have looked like, we're not totally sure. There's so much choice now, right? There says, choose Aleph, Bet, Gimel, you can do this one, you can do that one. And it's not super clear in the Sim Shalom, but that's the intention, right? Like you don't have to do the whole, like all the way through. And now that you've learned that it's reshut, now that you've learned that it's optional, maybe you'll feel compelled to just do one line, right? Because that's all you have time for. And at least that you've done, some of it. All right. Yeah, Gary.
I will say, along with that optionalness, I always found it interesting where, trying to say this diplomatically. So when we do it weekly, we do the Shomer, and then we run right to then people. It seems like they're willing for the optionality. They're willing to skip to the end, which we rarely skip. And for me, one of the heart of the Tachanun is the Avinu Malkeinu there. I mean, if there's one part I want to think of confessional and judgment and justice, it's the Avinu Malkeinu's there, and that's the part that we seem to most option.
Right. So I think, I'm not sure that we always know the intention of the prayer leader or what's going on or what the prayer leader has done. So it might seem like you're going from Shomer to the end, but maybe the prayer leader's already done that part and is kind of using the Chatima or that little box to sort of formally end the section, right? So like I might go, usually when I lead Tachanun, and we'll see some of the choreography in just a second. But like when I lead Tachanun, I do myself all the pieces that I'm going to do all the way through the end. And then for sake of leadership and bringing the community back together, I might sing Shomer Yisrael and I might do the Chatima, but I'm not doing them for myself. I'm doing them for the community, if that makes sense. So, so I guess you also can't always be in the head of the prayer leader. But I see what you mean. Like maybe we should sing Avinu Malkeinu as opposed to jumping to the very end or something like that. Something that people actually recognize and can sort of feel like connected to. So when do we not? The big question, as Gary sort of alluded to, is when do we not say Tachanun? Because we should assume that most times you do say Tachanun, and then what are the places where we actually are not supposed to say Tachanun? So Maimonides tackles this. Maimonides was one of the few sources who felt very strongly that this was a chiyuv, that he felt that this was a halacha, and so he had a lot to say about it. So he says, it is an accepted custom among the entire Jewish people not to utter the supplication on Shabbat or festivals, we know that, nor does one utter it on Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Chodesh, Hanukkah, or Purim, or in the Mincha on the eve of Shabbat or on holidays. So you'll see in the Siddur, it'll say, if something, holiday starting tonight, you don't say the Tachanun, and you don't say Tachanun ever at night. There are, however, individuals who do utter the supplication in the evening prayer. I have never seen it. It's not part of the liturgy in the Siddur. But I guess there's some commentator somewhere or some opinion somewhere that says that you can. The majority opinion is that you just say it during the day. On Yom Kippur only, one utters the supplication prayer in every prayer, since it is a day of supplication, requests, and fasting. So that's kind of like the big ones, right? These are the ones that maybe are considered to be sort of obvious. And then you have these days that are, quote, days with lesser elements of joy. This is not Maimonides. This was taken from somewhere else, sort of a variety of sources. So you don't say the Tachanun between Yom Kippur and Sukkot, also sort of like an elevated time of joy and celebration in that time of year. These three holidays of pilgrimage festivals, and the day after those holidays actually are called Isru Chag. It's kind of like extending the holiday just for a day. So you don't say it on the day after those holidays either, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Rosh Chodesh Sivan until Shavuot. The idea is that this is when Israel was standing at Sinai that whole time. Weddings and the 7 days after. So you don't say it on a wedding day. And then for 7 days after, you're supposed to be saying the Sheva Brachot at your meals. And so you wouldn't, and you're celebrating, you might celebrate a couple in the minyan with an aliyah, etc. So you don't say it on your wedding, and then you don't say it following the wedding either for a week. And the bar mitzvah, which is, Gary was brought up this bar mitzvah idea. This was one specific commentator who talks about the bar mitzvah as being as sort of joyous of a day as a wedding day. And so you don't say it in a bar mitzvah. And then Tisha B'Av is a strange one, right? So Tisha B'Av, you would think, because all up until now, what we've seen is joyful holidays. We don't say the Tachanun on joyful holidays because we don't want to reduce our joy by having to sort of, plummet into the world of confessions, right? But Tisha B'Av stands out because Tisha B'Av is obviously a solemn observant day. And why is the reason? The only one of these days that seems incongruous with the rest is Tisha B'Av, a day of national mourning. What is understandable that the supplications are not recited on festive days, but why not on a day of sorrow? One explanation is that Tachanun is not said in order to show that destruction paves the way for eventual redemption. Others say that Tisha B'Av will become a festival in the Messianic era. We talked about this when we talk about blessings, right? That we say a blessing even in a time of good and in a time of bad. The idea is that with every moment of blessing, we hope to get to a point in every moment of sort of destruction or sorrow, we hope that we can get to a moment of blessing. And this is a similar idea. So that we know we're going to come out of Tisha B'Av, and that unlike something joyful, that we included on that day as well. And then finally, it is not recited in the house of a mourner who has already experienced the deen. The idea is that you're supposed to experience this judgment, this deen, and would find the reminder of God's failing to heed God's cry humiliating, perhaps, right? This is just the language of Daniel Landis in My People's Prayer Book, but you can sort of understand that emotional state of being in mourning and then having to take on yet sort of another heavy piece of liturgy to ask for forgiveness or to use confessions. And I think for obvious reasons, it's been taken out. Thoughts? Comments before we keep going? Okay.
Well, I'd say that I love that it gives an explanation for the Rosh Chodesh Sivan until Shavuot, because it just says that in Siddur Sim Shalom, and I never understood why. So I thought that was a nice explanation there.
Yeah. It's not. I mean, it's kind of like the Monday, Thursday. Kind of putting some context to why we do certain things. Okay, so now we're going to just walk back a little bit and talk about this idea of prostration that I opened with. So I was sort of imagining that one used to fully prostrate oneself onto the ground, and that we don't do that anymore. So in the Shulchan Aruch, the originally Nefilat Apayim, which is what we're calling Tachanun, this section of the liturgy, was practiced either by lying flat on one's hands and feet extended, or by kneeling and lowering one's face to the ground. However, the custom nowadays is just to bow the head slightly and rest it on one's arm. So this is a semi more modern commentary, sort of already explaining why we don't fully lie on the floor. And in the Talmud, you can find a distinguished person is not permitted to fall on one's face in public unless one is confident that his prayers will be answered, since it may be considered disgraceful for him to fall on his face and not have his prayers answered. So actually, there's like some sort of like dramatic effect, right? You can imagine if somebody were in just a weekday minyan and sort of were to lay down and fall on one's face, what kind of drama that would sort of evoke in the community. And so there's an optics piece of it too, which I kind of like, actually, that the reason that we're not sort of lying down on the ground is because, I don't know, it feels like a little bit, maybe like it's too much. Like we don't actually know where these prayers are going to go. And so perhaps sort of laying yourself out on the ground is not necessarily in a weekday, in like a everyday setting. And then finally it says outside of the temple, a person is forbidden actually to prostrate himself on the stone floor. You may have seen like that. Sometimes when somebody prostrates on Yom Kippur, gets down on the ground, they put a talit in between themselves and the floor. And this is one of the reasons is that you're not actually supposed to put yourself on the dirty floor. You're supposed to sort of like protect yourself when you actually go down. And so yeah, you're not supposed to lie down on a stone floor, and many of the prayer spaces in those times were stone floors. Personally, I wouldn't want to lie on the chapel floor either. The sanctuary feels a bit more comfortable than the chapel, but you can sort of understand that idea of wanting to maintain, some sort of like just I don't know if normalcy is the right word, but not wanting to like so much trouble yourself and get into a place of being dirty or having to get down on the ground. That sort of putting your hand on your arm makes a lot more sense and still conveys this idea of bowing your head and supplicating that way. So how do we actually do this? We alluded to it a little bit. Back to Maimonides, because Maimonides is the one who cares, okay? So a lot of the other commentators don't. So what does it mean to prostrate? Maimonides asks. After one lifts his head from the fifth bow, he sits on the ground, falls with his face towards the earth, and utters the supplications that he desires. Kneeling always refers to falling to one's knees, and bowing is to bending over on one's face. Prostration is stretching out on one's hands until his feet is flat and his face on the ground. So he sort of talks you through these different pieces of choreography: kneeling, bowing, bending, prostrating, etc. And then the Torah in the Shulchan Aruch, as a commentator to the Shulchan Aruch, explains some of these. And I love this. I wonder if you've heard it before. The reason for prostrating oneself and sort of these different levels of standing, sitting, bowing, etc., is to get all three positions that Moses talks about in the Torah. So first it says, and I sat on the mountain for 40 days. So he's sitting, which is generally how we open, right? Except for the Monday, Thursday piece, which is now up for maybe discussion, that very, very opening piece. Standing, I stood on the mountain as first, and then I stood on the mountain as on the first 40 days and 40 nights. And then the last piece, as I fell on the ground, I fell down before God as at first for the 40 days and nights. So you can see the progression of the sitting, standing, and then prostrating. And we'll see that in the actual, in the text itself. So you're not supposed to interrupt between the Amidah and Tachanun, which is why we often give the cue before we start the Amidah, right? We say we're going to begin the silent Amidah followed by Tachanun, and people are sort of free to finish up their Amidah and go to their private prayers without any page calling. Now, this also probably leads to some of the confusion, right? Because for newcomers or for people who haven't seen this before, you're in a space of prayer, and you get this cue, which you might not totally understand. And then after the Amidah, everybody sits down in their seat and they go like this, and people are like wondering what's going on, right? And there's not a whole lot of context. But that's part of it, is that there's pieces of our liturgy that we're not supposed to interrupt, like we've talked about in the Shema. And generally, the Chatzi Kaddish would follow the Shema, which we talked about last week in the different Kaddishes. The Kaddish would follow the Amidah. But in this case, because there's Tachanun, we deferred the Kaddish till after. And then right now, of course, with Zoom, we're not doing the Kaddish there either. So when one's reciting Vayomer David El Gad, which is the very beginning of the regular Tachanun without the opening of Monday, Thursday, one should rest one's brow on one's arm, the left arm when you're not wearing tefillin, and the right arm when your tefillin is being worn. So if you have your tefillin, essentially you're not supposed to put your head on your tefillin, you're supposed to put it on the other side. And then of course, if you're left-handed and your tefillin's on the other side, you swap that instruction. The second part of the Tachanun, so you begin down, and you're down all the way. The second part of Tachanun on these days, on Mondays and Thursdays, on really on any of the days, begins with Shomer Yisrael. And on Shomer Yisrael, you're supposed to sit upright. So by the time you get to Shomer Yisrael, you're sitting upright, but you're not quite standing. In it, a person acknowledges that God is one's guardian, whom one is dependent, and also stresses reasons why the people of Israel are so important to God. Again, recited while in a seated position. And then the very last piece, Va'anachnu lo neda, we do not know what to do. So I'm going to show it to you in I want to show you sorry, what'd you say, Gary?
I was looking where it was in the book.
Yeah, so it's right after the Avinu Malkeinu. So here's the Shomer at the top of the page. We sometimes Shomer, Shomer Yisrael, right? You might recognize that melody. And then Mitratzeh Barachamim, Avinu Malkeinu, and right here, Va'anachnu lo neda, it says on these three words, it is customary then to stand. And so you complete your Tachanun standing, similar to how you had started. And then you're standing for, thank you, you're standing for what comes next, which is the Kaddish or potentially, depending on the day, taking out the Torah. Is that news to anybody? Great. And that's it. That is sort of the full, that was the last source that I have here. I'm happy to, spend the last 5 minutes chatting and talking about questions, taking questions. But there's actually quite clear choreography, given that it's not a halacha. There is some quite, some clear choreography that goes throughout. Yes, Ernie.
I never understood why people who are left-handed put the tefillin on their right hand, because I thought that the reason that we put tefillin on our left hand is that anatomically the left arm is closest to the heart, and even if you're left-handed, your heart is still
you're still your heart hasn't gone anywhere. Yeah, there's also about dominance of hand. Like you're supposed to put it on your non-dominant hand. And so there are some people that if they're left-handed, it's rare, but there are some people who, sorry, I should say it's obviously there are more right-handed people than left-handed generally, but it's about what I've read is about dominance, not necessarily about your heart always, but
it's clearly about the dominance why left-handed put it on their right hand.
That's right. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, that's exactly the reason. The question is if from the source that Ernie's talking about being close to your heart, that it wouldn't make sense in this piece. Though you do, regardless of where your tefillin is, well, I guess the sources differ, but we talked about this in the tzitzit, right? That you do start with your tzitzit on your left hand because it's closer to your heart, and then you actually switch it. And the question we asked during that class is, does that change with your tefillin? And I think the answer is no, that you would hold it no matter what because you're closer to your heart. Marcia.
This may seem kind of misplaced, but I'm looking at all this discussion of level of prostration. And these things were sort of written at a time when there were other Abrahamic religions in existence. And, in religious school, we were told, we never bow down. And all these other religions, Muslims prostrate themselves to the ground all the time, frequently in their service. Christians kneel. And I'm wondering if some of this is a reaction against what's going on in the community and around in the community, to say we're different and this is one way we look different in our prayer. This may not have any relevance.
So the fact that we don't go all the way down, or the fact that we do? The fact that we don't go all the way down, or
the fact that we don't prostrate ourselves. We'll put our hand on our arm rather than totally prostrate ourselves or totally kneel to the ground, except at Yom Kippur.
Great. Yeah. I guess I don't know exactly, but I think that based on some of the texts that we looked at from prostration and sort of not wanting to, I don't know if over dramatic is the right word, but not wanting to sort of, throw ourselves on the ground because of not necessarily knowing the full extent of the prayer being answered or what exactly, there's a lot of different language there. So to sort of throw yourself on the ground when it's unclear, I guess what the, what am I trying to say? When the sort of end result, if you will, right, is unclear, unlike a day like Yom Kippur, where you're sort of throwing out that the whole day is about confession, basically, right? But I like that as a thought, right? About sort of separating ourselves from other religions and not wanting to appear as if we're, participating in some sort of a Muslim tradition or something like that. Betsy, did you have your hand? No. Okay. Any other thoughts? All right. Well, this was a good one. There's much more to say. If you're interested in this chapter, I'm happy to scan it in for you. It's a nice opening, and you can spread the word about Tachanun and why we do this. I actually think that it's one of those things that I wish we could sort of every minyan say, like, just give 3 minutes about why, because I think